He stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a beacon of hope, articulating a dream that transformed a nation. Martin Luther King Jr. is etched in our minds as the unifying voice of the civil rights movement. But what if his greatest tests weren't just the overt acts of racism and violence, but the quieter, more insidious battles fought within his own ranks? What if the prophet of unity faced profound psychological isolation, dealing with skepticism, envy, and ideological clashes from those who were supposed to be his allies? This is the untold story of the internal dissent and the personal burden that threatened to derail a movement, and the man who, against all odds, held it together. Welcome to Behind the Legend, where we explore the psychological intricacies behind history's most influential figures. In today's episode, we delve deep into the life of Martin Luther King Jr., a man who became the face of the civil rights movement. Revered for his unwavering commitment to nonviolence and justice, King faced immense external opposition throughout his career. Yet it was the quiet battles from within that posed some of the greatest psychological challenges. While King's public image as a unifier is well known, the internal dynamics within the civil rights movement often tested his leadership, mental fortitude, and ability to keep the movement united. As factions grew, ideological divides deepened, and his own tactics were challenged, King had to fight a different war, a war against doubt, dissent, and isolation within his own ranks. In this video, we'll take a psychological deep dive into King's leadership style, exploring the internal dissent he faced, the personal toll of isolation, and the incredible resilience it took to keep moving forward. We will examine how King's internal struggles shaped not only his leadership, but the trajectory of the entire civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. did not seek leadership of the civil rights movement, it was thrust upon him. In 1955, when the Montgomery bus boycott began, King was an emerging preacher who had only recently become involved in activism. But his oratory skills, deep convictions, and commitment to nonviolence made him an ideal figurehead. Almost overnight, he became the public face of a movement that would change the course of American history. However, as with all powerful movements, King quickly learned that leadership came with its own set of psychological challenges. One of the earliest and most profound psychological challenges King faced was the sheer scale of the movement and its decentralized nature. The civil rights movement was not a monolithic entity. It was made up of various local, regional, and national groups, all with their own tactics, priorities, and leadership. King's leadership was not always welcomed by everyone in the movement. He was viewed by some as a moderate, while others saw him as too idealistic, too slow to push for direct action, or too focused on the moral high ground of nonviolence. This lack of uniformity in the movement's approach led to friction, internal dissent, and at times outright opposition. Psychologically, this disunity presented a major challenge for King. He had to manage a delicate balance between appeasing different factions within the movement while staying true to his own deeply held beliefs about nonviolence and reconciliation. His ability to unify these factions was constantly tested. While he called for peaceful demonstrations, other leaders, particularly younger activists, felt that King was not pushing hard enough, not demanding results fast enough. This generational divide would become more pronounced as the movement gained momentum. Moreover, King's position at the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, did not guarantee unquestioned loyalty. Many within the SCLC, as well as members of other organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, questioned his leadership and methods. Some of them, like Stokely Carmichael and other members of SNCC, began to criticize King's emphasis on peaceful protests, arguing that the movement needed to be more radical and confrontational to achieve real change. This internal criticism and factionalism led to a sense of isolation for King, as he had to continuously defend his approach and maintain control over a movement that was growing increasingly divided in its tactics and goals. Despite this, King remained committed to his vision. He saw nonviolence not just as a tactic, but as a moral and spiritual framework, believing it to be the only path to achieving true justice and reconciliation. But the emotional toll of constantly fighting to maintain unity while remaining true to his principles was immense. King's psychological strength was tested every time he had to confront dissent from within his own ranks. The tension between King's vision of peaceful change and the impatience of those who wanted more immediate, radical action created a psychological pressure cooker. King had to navigate not only the violent opposition of segregationists and racists, but also the ideological rifts within the very movement he was leading. These internal struggles led to moments of profound self-doubt. Was he the right person to lead this movement? Was nonviolence truly the best path to change, or was it a naive and outdated ideal in a world full of injustice? These questions haunted King, and yet he pressed on, driven by a deep conviction that his approach would lead to lasting, meaningful change. In the midst of this turmoil, King often found himself turning inward. He sought strength in his faith, in the teachings of Gandhi, and in his own understanding of justice. However, the psychological toll of leading such a turbulent movement, especially during times of increased dissent, was undeniably heavy. King's inner world became a battleground where his personal beliefs, his doubts, and the external pressures collided. His ability to manage these psychological pressures while maintaining his leadership role speaks to his incredible resilience, but it also highlights the profound isolation he faced in this journey. As the movement progressed, the ideological divides within the civil rights movement would only grow. Yet, King's early experiences with dissent laid the foundation for how he would navigate the challenges that would follow, both within the movement and beyond. His leadership would be defined not just by his ability to withstand external opposition, but by his ability to remain grounded in his vision of peace, justice, and reconciliation in the face of internal fragmentation. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, it became increasingly clear that there was a profound ideological split within the ranks. While Martin Luther King Jr. remained steadfast in his commitment to nonviolence, other factions within the movement began to call for a more radical approach to addressing racial inequality. The rise of the Black Power movement, spearheaded by figures like Stokely Carmichael and organizations such as the Black Panther Party, posed a direct challenge to King's vision of peaceful resistance. These growing tensions forced King to confront one of the most significant psychological challenges of his leadership: how to maintain unity and moral authority while competing ideologies threatened to pull the movement apart. The nonviolent approach championed by King was rooted in his deep belief in the power of love and moral persuasion. He drew inspiration from Gandhi's philosophy of passive resistance, advocating for peaceful protests, marches, and sit-ins as a way to appeal to the conscience of the American public. King's method was not just a strategy, it was an expression of his spiritual and moral commitment to creating a society based on justice and reconciliation. For King, nonviolence was the only path to achieving true social change, as it allowed for the preservation of human dignity while challenging systems of oppression. However, as the movement grew, younger activists, frustrated by the slow pace of change and the constant violence they faced, began to question King's tactics. The Black Power movement, with its emphasis on self-defense, Black pride, and a willingness to confront violence with violence if necessary, attracted a growing following. These leaders argued that nonviolence was a strategy that had failed to bring about the radical transformation necessary to dismantle systemic racism. They believed that Black people needed to embrace their cultural identity, build their own economic and political power, and defend themselves against white aggression. For King, this challenge was deeply personal. He believed that nonviolence was not just the best option, it was the only moral option. To him, Black Power was a rejection of the very principles that could lead to long-term change. King knew that the psychological and moral toll of violence on both individuals and society would only perpetuate cycles of hatred and division. But the rise of Black Power created a public rift between King and other prominent figures in the civil rights movement. Leaders like Carmichael, Malcolm X, and even certain members of King's own inner circle began to criticize him for being too slow, too compromising, and too idealistic. The movement's ideological fault lines had deepened, and King, as the figurehead of nonviolence, was caught in the crossfire. Psychologically, the situation was incredibly challenging for King. He was not only leading a movement that was under attack from external forces, but now facing division and ideological dissent within his own ranks. King was a man who had always prided himself on being a unifier, a moral leader who could bring people together for a common cause. But now, with the rise of Black power, he was forced to confront the reality that unity would be harder to maintain. In the face of these disagreements, King struggled to remain true to his beliefs while also addressing the legitimate grievances of the Black Power movement. At times, King's frustration was palpable. He saw the rise of Black power as a betrayal of the unity that had been so central to the movement's success. For him, the rejection of nonviolence represented a step backward, a move toward division and hatred that could undermine the progress made thus far. The challenge for King, however, was not just in defending his own philosophy, it was in maintaining his leadership in a time when ideological loyalty was fracturing. He had to navigate the personal psychological toll of feeling misunderstood by those who shared his ultimate goals, but differed dramatically on the means to achieve them. In response to these challenges, King worked tirelessly to mediate the divisions within the movement. He sought to engage with the Black power advocates and show them that their goals for racial justice could be achieved through nonviolence. He used his platform to publicly call for unity, hoping to bridge the gap between radical and moderate voices within the movement. However, the psychological strain of constantly defending nonviolence while facing increasing opposition from within was immense. King's mental and emotional stamina were tested as he continued to emphasize the moral superiority of nonviolence, even as the movement around him seemed to embrace more militant tactics. The internal divide between nonviolence and Black power was not merely an ideological disagreement. It was a reflection of the psychological pressure each faction felt in their pursuit of justice. For King, nonviolence was more than a strategy. It was a way of being. It was a reflection of his belief in the inherent dignity of every human being, regardless of race or background. For others, Black power represented a more immediate, assertive approach to addressing the long-standing injustice of segregation, police brutality, and economic inequality. Both sides of the movement had legitimate concerns, and the psychological toll of trying to reconcile these differing approaches must have been overwhelming for King. Yet, despite these pressures, King remained committed to his vision of peaceful resistance. He understood that the long-term success of the movement depended on maintaining moral high ground, even in the face of rising militancy. For King, the psychological and emotional cost of maintaining his principles in such a hostile environment was profound. There were times when he must have doubted his ability to keep the movement united, especially as divisions deepened and as the movement's tactics became more varied and polarized. King had to contend with the feeling of being caught between two competing ideologies, one calling for peace and reconciliation, the other for confrontation and radical change. In many ways, King's leadership during this period reflects the psychological challenges that all leaders face when navigating internal dissent. It requires a tremendous amount of resilience to hold on to one's core values while being attacked, criticized, and misunderstood by those who should be allies. King's ability to remain steadfast in his commitment to nonviolence, despite the ideological divide within the movement, is a testament to his mental fortitude. However, the cost of this leadership was clear. King's personal isolation deepened as the movement became more fragmented, and his sense of trust in others began to erode. The ideological schism within the civil rights movement ultimately took a toll on King's emotional and psychological well-being. As much as he tried to hold the movement together, the differing visions for change created a rift that would only widen over time. The rise of Black power and the rejection of nonviolence represented a challenge not just to King's leadership, but to the very principles on which the movement was founded. And yet, despite the toll this dissent took on him, King continued to press forward, driven by an unshakable belief that nonviolence was the only path to true justice. Martin Luther King Jr. was no stranger to external criticism. From the moment he became a leader of the civil rights movement, he faced violent opposition from segregationists, white supremacists, and even parts of the government. However, What many do not often realize is that King also had to contend with an equally significant source of emotional and psychological pressure: internal criticism. This internal dissent didn't just come from radical factions within the movement, like those who advocated for Black power, but also from within the very organizations he led, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, as well as from colleagues, fellow activists, and even people within his inner circle. The internal criticism King faced was multifaceted. On one hand, many activists and leaders felt that King was not aggressive enough, that his nonviolent stance was too idealistic in the face of the daily brutality African Americans experienced. For others, King's approach was simply too slow, too methodical. The impatience of many who felt that the movement was not moving fast enough often translated into harsh criticism of King's methods. Leaders like Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, and others in the Black Power movement argued that King's commitment to nonviolence was allowing the status quo to remain intact, rather than effecting the sweeping changes they believed were necessary. King was also criticized for being too willing to compromise, which was seen as a sign of weakness by some of his more radical contemporaries. The fact that he continually emphasized reconciliation and cooperation, even with white Americans who were involved in maintaining the system of segregation, led some to label him as a sellout or a moderate. To some in the Black community, King was seen as a leader who was more concerned with pleasing white America than with truly advancing the cause of Black liberation. The emotional toll of this criticism was heavy on King. He was someone who had worked tirelessly for the movement, someone whose very identity was entwined with its success. To be accused of compromising or being ineffective struck at the very core of his being. It was one thing to face external opposition, where King knew the forces arrayed against him were acting from a place of hate and ignorance. But the accusations from within his own ranks cut deeper. They called into question his competence, his moral clarity, and his commitment to the cause. The psychological burden of being constantly questioned and attacked from within, especially by those who shared his goals, was immense. One of the most painful aspects of this internal dissent was that it came not only from activists who disagreed with his methods, but also from within the SCLC and his own team. It's hard to overstate how isolating this must have felt for King. He was already facing the immense stress of leading a movement that was under attack from nearly every corner of society. Now, he had to contend with doubts and accusations from those who were supposed to be his allies, those who shared his vision of equality and justice. King's leadership was constantly under scrutiny, even by those closest to him. In addition to ideological criticisms, King also faced more personal attacks. His charisma and prominence in the civil rights movement made him a highly visible target for character assassination. In 1964, for instance, the FBI began a campaign to undermine King's reputation. They used his personal life against him, attempting to discredit him through false accusations of infidelity and moral failings. King was aware of the FBI's efforts to tarnish his image, and the constant stress of these attacks compounded the other pressures he was already under. As a leader, the personal attacks were particularly difficult, as they not only questioned his leadership, but also undermined the moral authority on which he built his movement. Psychologically, King's ability to withstand these constant personal and professional attacks reveals much about his mental fortitude. He continued to press forward in the face of criticism, not only from those who were ideologically opposed to him, but also from those who should have been allies. But this resilience came at a cost. The emotional weight of being vilified by both enemies and sometimes friends took a toll on his mental health. There were moments when King found himself questioning his own effectiveness, feeling the psychological strain of being a prophet who was expected to lead without wavering. He wrestled with self-doubt, wondering whether the sacrifices he was making, both personally and psychologically, were worth the toll they were taking on his health, his family, and his spirit. Despite these internal battles, King's resolve remained unbroken. He believed deeply in the righteousness of his cause, and he had a profound understanding of the importance of maintaining his moral integrity. For King, leading the civil rights movement was not just about winning legal victories or achieving political power. It was about embodying a higher moral vision. His commitment to nonviolence, his belief in love as a transformative force, and his unwavering dedication to justice were all rooted in his deep religious faith. This spiritual foundation allowed him to endure the personal attacks and criticism from both sides, even as the psychological weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. However, the psychological cost of maintaining his public image as a leader of unwavering integrity was steep. It placed a barrier between King and the people closest to him. While he was able to connect with the broader movement, his emotional isolation deepened. He had few places to turn for solace, and as the movement became more divided, he found it increasingly difficult to maintain his trust in others. Leaders are often expected to bear the weight of a cause, but King's ability to do so despite the constant internal and external challenges speaks to a profound psychological resilience. Still, even the most resilient individuals can only carry such heavy burdens for so long. King's experiences of internal dissent, personal attacks, and criticism left a lasting mark on him. But through it all, he remained steadfast in his commitment to his vision of a just and equal society. His ability to continue leading, despite the psychological toll of these attacks, underscores the immense mental strength required to lead a movement in the face of such overwhelming pressure. King's personal isolation, born of both external and internal conflicts, was perhaps one of the most significant and painful aspects of his journey. But it also highlighted the true cost of leadership in a transformative movement and the immense emotional and psychological toll required to lead through division and dissent. As the civil rights movement grew in both size and scope, so did the complexities of managing its diverse factions. Martin Luther King Jr. found himself at the center of not only external pressures from the system of segregation, but also the increasingly fractious internal dynamics of the movement itself. King was a natural mediator and diplomat, skilled at uniting people under a shared cause. However, as the movement evolved, so too did the challenges of keeping the various factions aligned with a common purpose. The ideological divide between nonviolence and more radical movements like Black Power, along with shifting political strategies, created a psychological maze that King had to navigate with both care and resilience. At the heart of the challenge was King's role as the leader of a decentralized movement that lacked a single, cohesive structure. While the SCLC was an organized national entity, there were countless other local and regional groups with different priorities and goals. These groups often had their own leaders, and many felt that King's leadership didn't always reflect their own desires for immediate and radical change. Some were frustrated with King's nonviolent stance, believing it was ineffective in the face of violent repression. Others felt that King's emphasis on cooperation and reconciliation compromised the urgency of the movement's goals. The psychological strain of managing these competing interests was immense. King was aware that keeping the movement together required constant effort, a delicate balance between maintaining unity and respecting the diversity of opinions within the ranks. He frequently found himself walking a tightrope, trying to appease more radical voices without alienating those who supported his peaceful approach. The burden of being the figurehead of the civil rights movement, the one expected to unify the movement's fragmented parts, created a deep sense of psychological exhaustion for King. One of the strategies King used to manage this internal dissension was his ability to engage in moral persuasion. King was a master of framing the movement's goals in terms of moral imperatives, appealing to both the conscience of the public and the movement's diverse factions. He continuously reminded everyone of the shared values of justice, equality, and freedom. He used his speeches and public appearances to reinforce the idea that nonviolence was not just a tactical approach, but a moral commitment that could lead to real social change. King's rhetorical skill was a powerful tool, but it also came with its own psychological challenges. The constant need to persuade, to mediate, to serve as the unifying voice placed a heavy burden on his mental and emotional resources. Another tactic King employed was strategic retreats. He often recognized when a particular ideological battle was too divisive to engage with fully, or when trying to unify the movement around one issue would cause further fracturing. In these moments, King would shift focus, emphasizing new goals or new tactics to maintain momentum. For example, in the wake of his unsuccessful attempts to reconcile the differences between the nonviolent and Black Power factions, King began to focus on economic justice and poverty, seeking to unite people across racial lines for a broader societal change. This shift culminated in his Poor People's Campaign, which sought to address issues of economic inequality and would serve as a platform for both Black and white Americans to unite in their shared struggles. While the Poor People's Campaign was not as successful as King had hoped, it demonstrated his ability to pivot and seek common ground when necessary, even if it meant distancing himself from other issues of direct action. The mental and emotional toll of constantly pivoting to accommodate different factions and goals was profound. King's ability to maintain his focus on the larger mission of justice, despite these challenges, demonstrated an immense psychological resilience. However, the psychological cost of such constant strategizing was not without its consequences. King's sense of isolation deepened as he increasingly found himself walking alone in the political labyrinth, where his every decision was scrutinized and his every word dissected by both allies and critics. His desire to maintain unity often required him to silence his own doubts and fears, to push through moments of deep internal conflict, and to endure personal emotional exhaustion. Moreover, as King began to shift his focus from civil rights to broader issues such as economic inequality and opposition to the Vietnam War, he increasingly found himself alienated from the mainstream of American society, as well as from some of his allies in the civil rights movement. While his stance on the Vietnam War earned him widespread acclaim in some quarters, it also led to a rift with many of his supporters. His decision to speak out against the war alienated some of his most important allies, and the psychological strain of being criticized from both the left and the right began to mount. For a man whose public image had been crafted around unity, standing alone on such a controversial issue was an incredibly isolating experience. In the face of these challenges, King continued to rely on his faith and moral clarity. His conviction that he was fighting for a greater cause helped him to remain steadfast in the face of adversity. Yet, it was clear that the constant tension between different factions, the ideological rifts, and the psychological exhaustion of leading in such a high-stakes environment were taking their toll. King's resilience, however, was not simply a matter of personal strength. It was a reflection of his unwavering belief in the ultimate moral truth of his cause. He knew that if the movement was to succeed, it had to remain unified, but he also recognized that this unity could not be achieved by ignoring the internal struggles within the movement. This balancing act between factions, ideals, and personal exhaustion speaks to the profound psychological complexity of leadership during times of radical change. King's ability to keep the movement moving forward, despite constant division, speaks to his immense resilience, but also to the emotional and mental costs of leadership. He was forced to carry the weight of every faction, every criticism, and every failure while maintaining the vision that had inspired millions. In this process, he found himself more isolated than ever, as both ideological factions and even his own supporters began to pull in different directions. The psychological toll of leading through division and dissent is a challenge that all leaders face, particularly those at the helm of social movements. King's ability to navigate this labyrinth of competing interests and to maintain his moral vision despite the pressure shows the power of conviction, but it also highlights the profound mental exhaustion that can accompany transformational leadership. It is a reminder that true leadership requires not only the ability to inspire, but also the strength to weather the storms of internal and external conflict without losing sight of the greater goal. As the civil rights movement continued to gain momentum and King's stature as a leader grew, so too did the psychological isolation he experienced. The more King spoke out about issues of racial justice, economic equality, and peace, the more he found himself at odds with people who were once his allies. His increasing focus on the interconnectedness of social issues, such as his opposition to the Vietnam War and his campaign for economic justice with the Poor People's Campaign, widened the ideological rifts, not just within the movement, but also between him and the broader political establishment. The psychological toll of this isolation was profound. King was not only fighting against the entrenched systems of racial segregation and violence, he was now facing a crisis of leadership as the movement's internal dynamics became more fragmented and some of his closest allies began to distance themselves from him. As King broadened his critique of American society, expressing his opposition to the Vietnam War and calling for a broader redistribution of wealth, his stance became more controversial, alienating some within the movement who felt that his nonviolent philosophy no longer addressed the urgent demands of those suffering under the weight of systemic oppression. King's decision to speak out against the Vietnam War in 1967 was a turning point in his leadership. While his anti-war stance was consistent with his broader philosophy of nonviolence, it put him in direct conflict with many political leaders and civil rights activists, including some of his most trusted allies. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been a supporter of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, was deeply offended by King's opposition to the war. This led to a rupture in their relationship and increased King's sense of alienation from political leaders and the more moderate elements within the movement. Additionally, many within the civil rights movement, especially those who prioritized immediate action on racial justice, felt that King's focus on international issues diluted the urgency of fighting for civil rights at home. Psychologically, this deepening isolation weighed heavily on King. His role as a leader of the movement had already been emotionally taxing, as he was constantly balancing the pressures from within and outside of the movement. But now, with increasing ideological divisions and the alienation from people who had once been his closest supporters, King began to feel like a prophet without a congregation. His decision to broaden his critiques and advocate for a more holistic vision of justice, which included addressing poverty and opposition to war, meant that he was now at odds with a significant portion of the movement. King's isolation wasn't just intellectual or political, it was deeply personal. As the central figure in the movement, King was expected to maintain unity and resolve, but his commitment to his vision left him vulnerable to growing doubts and criticisms from within the movement. The feeling of being pulled in multiple directions, from radical factions on the one hand to more moderate leaders on the other, often left him in a state of psychological conflict. To be a leader of such a monumental cause meant that his every decision and statement was scrutinized, not only by the public, but by those closest to him. There were moments when King must have questioned his own role in the movement. The weight of the decision to continue pushing for non-violence in the face of rising militancy, as well as the pressure of trying to balance a broad array of demands and priorities, must have led to profound moments of self-doubt. King was not just leading a movement for civil rights, he was taking on the mantle of moral leadership for an entire nation, one that was deeply divided and struggling with its own moral conscience. His sense of isolation grew as his vision expanded and as his focus moved from just civil rights to broader questions of social justice. At the same time, King's increasing focus on economic justice and the global dimension of his activism further alienated him from those who believed that his leadership should remain firmly focused on racial integration. King's involvement in the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, which sought to address poverty in America across racial lines, further compounded his sense of isolation. Many in the movement, as well as in the African American community, felt that King's focus on poverty and his call for economic redistribution detracted from the primary goal of ending segregation. King's struggle to bring together the issues of racial justice and economic equality, while noble, put him at odds with many factions within the movement who feared that this broader focus would dilute the urgency of addressing racial discrimination. The loneliness King felt was amplified by his personal life as well. As the leader of a movement that required constant attention and energy, King's personal relationships were strained. His wife, Coretta Scott King, was often by his side, but the emotional toll of his work left him with little time for deep personal connection. King was often physically absent from his family, consumed by the demands of leadership and emotionally exhausted from the weight of his responsibilities. The demands of being both a father and a leader of a nationwide movement created a paradox. He was a public figure whose every move was scrutinized, but his private life was marked by a profound emotional isolation. This duality, being at once the leader of a transformative movement and an individual facing intense isolation, was a key part of King's internal psychological landscape. As much as he was a public figure, King was also a man grappling with the human cost of leadership. His moments of loneliness, doubt, and frustration were often buried beneath the expectations of others. He was expected to remain steadfast, to be a figure of unwavering moral clarity. But the emotional toll of navigating these expectations was profound. King's isolation, both public and private, spoke to the price of leadership on a monumental scale. In many ways, King's deepening isolation was a reflection of the inherent loneliness that often accompanies transformative leadership. Those who seek to change the world, particularly in such profound ways, often find themselves isolated, not only because their vision sets them apart, but because the very nature of leadership requires them to stand alone in difficult times. For King, this isolation was a necessary part of his role as a leader, but it was also a psychological burden that weighed heavily on him, leaving him with few allies in his most challenging moments. King's ability to continue pushing forward, despite his isolation and the emotional toll of his leadership, speaks to the resilience of his character. Yet, it is crucial to understand that even the most remarkable leaders face moments of profound loneliness and self-doubt. King's story serves as a reminder that leadership, especially in times of radical change, often comes with a personal price. For King, that price was emotional isolation, the loneliness that comes with being a visionary leader who must navigate not only external forces, but also internal divisions and personal sacrifice. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy is often portrayed as a singular vision of unity, peace, and racial justice, epitomized by his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. However, behind the iconic moments and the public image of a leader who managed to unify millions under the banner of equality, there is a more complex and less frequently discussed reality, one where King faced constant internal dissent, ideological clashes, and growing isolation. Despite these challenges, he was able to maintain an unwavering commitment to his principles. King's resilience, both mental and emotional, was integral to his leadership, but it was also shaped by the psychological cost of maintaining a singular vision amidst overwhelming division. As we reflect on King's journey, it becomes clear that his ability to sustain his vision of nonviolence and justice was inextricably linked to his profound resilience. Despite the ideological fault lines within the movement, the harsh criticism from those who questioned his methods, and the personal isolation he endured, King's conviction remained steadfast. What made his leadership remarkable was not just his ability to lead under pressure, but his ability to persist in the face of mounting internal opposition. The cost, however, was significant. As King's public persona continued to grow, so did the weight of maintaining his moral high ground and the expectations placed upon him. King's psychological resilience was grounded in his faith and moral vision. He believed deeply in the power of nonviolence, and his commitment to this principle was unshakable, even as other voices in the movement began to reject it. King's unyielding focus on nonviolence wasn't just strategic, it was a matter of personal and moral integrity. He knew that the movement needed to set an example, that the moral authority of the civil rights movement could not be compromised by the same violence it was fighting against. This unshakable belief in the power of love and moral persuasion served as the psychological backbone of King's leadership, providing him with the strength to withstand external and internal pressures. But the isolation that accompanied this sense of conviction was profound. To lead with such clarity and commitment meant that King could not fully engage with those who did not share his vision. He had to be resolute in his principles, which sometimes left him alone in his stance, especially as the political and social landscape shifted around him. The rise of more militant factions within the movement and the deepening of ideological rifts meant that King often found himself standing alone, even among those who were supposed to be his allies. The burden of King's singular vision also became evident as the movement progressed. While King's focus on nonviolence and integration remained his guiding principle, many of the challenges he faced were not external. The movement itself became more fractured, and the people he had worked alongside began to question whether King's approach was enough. The increasing fragmentation of the civil rights movement meant that the moral clarity King had championed was no longer enough to hold the movement together. As new voices called for more radical change, King was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that his dream of unity was, perhaps, an illusion. Yet King's ability to keep moving forward despite these internal divisions speaks to his extraordinary resilience. He continued to preach a message of unity, justice, and nonviolence, even as the movement around him became more polarized. His resilience was rooted in his commitment to his vision, but it was also a recognition that the work he had begun was far from finished. King understood that the movement was a long-term struggle, and the obstacles he faced were just a small part of the larger battle for racial equality. The psychological fortitude required to lead such a movement while facing constant challenges and contradictions shows the true nature of leadership. One of the most poignant aspects of King's leadership was his ability to continue fighting, even when he saw the end of his journey as a leader coming closer. By the late 1960s, King's focus had expanded beyond civil rights to include issues of economic justice, poverty, and the Vietnam War. His Poor People's Campaign aimed to address the systemic economic inequality that many African Americans faced, and his stance on the Vietnam War alienated him from many of his former allies, including the Johnson administration. King had always sought to address the root causes of inequality, but his new focus on poverty and global peace broadened his critique of American society, placing him at odds with the political mainstream. This shift in focus was also a reflection of King's deepening understanding of the interconnectedness of social issues. He had always believed in the idea of justice as a universal cause, and by the late 1960s, he recognized that the struggle for civil rights could not be separated from the struggles for economic equality and international peace. This broader vision, however, did not come without personal cost. The widening of his focus created even greater isolation, as those within the movement who had once supported his leadership were now questioning his expanded agenda. King had always been a visionary, but now his vision was at odds with some of his closest allies, and this created both strategic and psychological challenges for him. Despite these challenges, King's resolve remained unbroken. His unwavering conviction to address not just racial injustice, but all forms of inequality, including economic and political oppression, is a testament to the depth of his moral clarity. Yet the personal toll was significant. The burden of carrying such a vision, especially in the face of widespread dissent from both within and outside the movement, took a toll on his mental and emotional well-being. King knew that his work was far from done, and the pressure of knowing that his time was limited, combined with the psychological weight of leading an increasingly fragmented movement, made his task even more difficult. King's story is not one of easy victories or unchallenged success. It is a story of resilience, conviction, and the psychological cost of being a leader in the midst of radical change. His leadership demonstrated that true transformation requires more than just external battles. It requires a deep internal strength to navigate ideological splits, face personal attacks, and endure the loneliness that comes with carrying a profound vision for change. King's vision for a just and equal society was not just a dream, it was a reality that he worked toward every day, even as his health and mental well-being deteriorated. His legacy is not just the civil rights movement, but the enduring power of moral conviction and psychological resilience in the face of adversity. The life and leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. offer more than just a historical narrative of a movement. His story is a profound psychological study of resilience, conviction, and sacrifice, one that holds enduring lessons for anyone striving to lead in difficult times. King's journey was not a smooth ascent to success. It was fraught with internal division, personal isolation, and the immense psychological pressure of navigating a complex, multifaceted struggle for justice. Through his story, we can draw powerful universal lessons about leadership, resilience, and the personal cost of pursuing a transformative vision in the face of relentless opposition. One of the most important lessons from King's leadership is the power of visionary resilience. King's ability to maintain his commitment to a singular vision of nonviolence and equality, even in the face of growing internal dissent and external pressure, underscores the power of holding a clear, unwavering vision. Leaders are often called upon to stand firm in their beliefs and to guide others with clarity of purpose. King's resilience was not just about enduring hardship, it was about staying focused on a larger goal, racial equality and justice, while navigating the complexities of leadership. His ability to withstand personal and political challenges was rooted in his deep belief that his cause was just, that nonviolence was the most powerful way to dismantle systems of oppression. For those of us facing difficult leadership challenges, King's example teaches us the value of a clear and deeply held vision that can withstand the pressures of momentary setbacks and internal strife. Yet King's resilience was not only a matter of perseverance, it was a psychological act of endurance. His journey highlights the importance of having emotional stamina in the face of prolonged adversity. Leadership in times of crisis or societal change demands not just strategic thinking, but emotional intelligence. The psychological toll of King's leadership, including the isolation and personal sacrifices he made, reveals that leadership is not always about having all the answers or being universally supported. It is often about having the mental strength to continue, despite the doubts, criticisms, and challenges that may surround you. For King, this meant withstanding attacks from within his own movement and dealing with the psychological consequences of his leadership choices. His story illustrates that emotional resilience is not about being invulnerable, but about knowing how to manage internal pain while continuing to fulfill a greater purpose. Another universal lesson from King's story is the importance of moral clarity in times of division. King was steadfast in his belief that nonviolence was not just a strategy, but a moral imperative. In the face of increasing dissent within the movement, King could have adjusted his approach, diluted his message, or tried to appease more radical voices in order to maintain unity. But he chose not to, understanding that moral integrity was at the core of his leadership. This commitment to moral clarity, even when it was unpopular or isolated him from others, allowed King to maintain a sense of purpose that was rooted in his vision of a just society. For leaders today, King's example underscores the importance of moral leadership in times of division. It is not always easy to take a stand or to maintain a consistent ethical position, especially when faced with opposing views from those around you. But King's unwavering commitment to nonviolence and his moral clarity, even when he was criticized for being too idealistic or too slow, remind us that leadership is not just about popularity. It is about doing what is right, even when it's hard. King's ability to sustain his vision amid ideological conflicts also speaks to the power of personal sacrifice in leadership. King was a leader who gave everything to the movement: his time, his energy, his health, and ultimately his life. His personal sacrifices were not abstract or theoretical, they were tangible and immediate. As the movement grew, King found himself increasingly isolated, not just politically, but personally. His commitment to the cause meant that he spent less time with his family, endured public scrutiny, and faced deep emotional exhaustion. Yet he continued forward, driven by the knowledge that the work he was doing was part of something much larger than himself. King's story teaches us that true leadership often requires personal sacrifice. Whether it's sacrificing time, resources, or emotional well-being, leaders are often called upon to give more of themselves than they initially anticipated. While personal sacrifices can be taxing, King's legacy shows us that such sacrifices can lead to profound and lasting change. King's experience also brings to light the importance of building a unified vision while managing division. As the civil rights movement became more fragmented, with different factions advocating for different methods, King remained committed to his vision of nonviolence and integration. However, the ideological divide in the movement made his role as a unifier increasingly difficult. King was forced to navigate a complex landscape, one where his position as a leader often meant playing the role of mediator, consensus builder, and moral guide. He had to bring together different groups, sometimes with opposing views, in order to continue making progress toward the larger goal of racial equality. King's experience offers a powerful lesson for leaders. It is not always easy to unify people with differing goals, but it is essential to keep focused on the common purpose, reminding everyone of the larger vision. His ability to reconcile different voices within the movement, even when he could not fully satisfy everyone, is a testament to the importance of strategic compromise and the recognition that unity does not mean unanimity. Moreover, King's leadership provides an important lesson about psychological fortitude in the face of betrayal and division. It is easy for leaders to remain steadfast when they have the full support of those around them. But King's ability to stay true to his principles, despite being criticized by allies and undermined by opponents, demonstrates the mental strength required to lead when everyone isn't on your side. King's psychological resilience was rooted not just in his intellectual commitment to the cause, but in his emotional and spiritual strength. His deep faith allowed him to withstand the doubts and criticisms that would have broken many other leaders. In the broader context, King's leadership challenges the myth of the unified, smooth-running movement. His journey shows us that leadership in transformative times is often about navigating division and conflict within oneself, within one's team, and in the larger society. True leadership requires not just managing the external battles, but also dealing with the internal struggles, doubts, and sacrifices that accompany the pursuit of radical change. King's ability to lead through this complexity, maintaining his vision while enduring personal and political turmoil, offers a timeless example of what it means to lead with integrity and resilience. King's story ultimately asks us to consider the question, what is the cost of leadership, and how can we navigate the challenges of leadership, internal dissent, personal sacrifice, and external opposition, while staying true to our vision and our values? Martin Luther King Jr. faced these questions every day, and his ability to persist, despite overwhelming psychological and emotional challenges, offers us invaluable lessons in leadership, resilience, and the power of conviction. The life and leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. provide rich insights not only into the challenges of transformative leadership, but also into the personal and psychological costs of pursuing a larger vision. In examining King's journey, we can derive actionable strategies for cultivating resilience, managing internal dissent, and staying true to one's core values when facing personal or professional pressure. King's example provides guidance on how to navigate conflicts, remain grounded in a clear vision, and lead in a way that is both morally consistent and practically effective. One key lesson from King's leadership is the power of maintaining a clear vision, especially when facing division or opposition. King's unwavering commitment to nonviolence and racial justice gave him a sense of purpose that could endure ideological disagreements, internal dissent, and even personal attacks. For anyone in a leadership role, having a clear vision provides direction and serves as an anchor during turbulent times. When faced with dissent, whether from within your team or external critics, returning to your core values and vision can help you stay focused. It allows you to keep moving forward, even when the path is uncertain or the pressures are overwhelming. King's ability to maintain his vision, despite constant questioning, demonstrates the importance of clarity in leadership. Another important lesson from King's leadership is the need for psychological resilience. King endured constant external and internal pressure, but his ability to withstand these stresses without losing his focus on the movement's moral goals was remarkable. Psychological resilience is crucial for leaders who must navigate adversity. It's not about avoiding the emotional toll, but about finding ways to manage stress and stay grounded during difficult times. One strategy King used was grounding his leadership in his spiritual faith and a larger moral framework. For modern leaders, developing emotional intelligence and cultivating support systems, whether through personal relationships, professional networks, or spiritual grounding, can provide a similar foundation to weather leadership's stresses. In King's case, managing internal dissent was a continual challenge. The ideological divisions within the civil rights movement often made it difficult for him to maintain unity, but he did so through effective communication, negotiation, and moral persuasion. His ability to communicate his vision and persuade others to rally behind it, despite differing opinions, was central to his success. For leaders facing internal conflict, cultivating open lines of communication and engaging in active listening can be powerful tools. It's also important to understand that, like King, leaders may need to occasionally compromise or step back to prevent further division. This doesn't mean abandoning core values, but rather focusing on the larger mission while navigating differing perspectives. Emotional intelligence was another tool that King wielded effectively. He understood the power of empathy and connection with those around him. Despite being deeply isolated in many ways, King knew the importance of connecting with people, understanding their concerns, and finding common ground. As a leader, developing empathy and emotional intelligence helps you build trust with your team, manage conflicts, and create an environment where everyone feels heard and valued. King's empathy allowed him to understand the frustrations of his critics while maintaining his own integrity and vision. King's journey also teaches us the importance of embracing personal sacrifice. Leadership often requires difficult decisions, and sometimes it means giving up personal comfort or happiness for the greater good. King's work was deeply demanding and took a personal toll, physically, emotionally, and mentally. While modern leaders may not face the same magnitude of sacrifice, King's story reminds us that the road to meaningful change often involves personal costs. The key is to be aware of the sacrifices required and to manage them with self-awareness and mindfulness. Leaders should ensure they have healthy boundaries and support systems to sustain their energy, but also acknowledge the times when deep personal commitment is required for the cause they lead. Finally, one of the most practical lessons from King's life is the importance of staying true to your core values amidst pressure. King faced constant criticism from segregationists, from government officials, from within the civil rights movement itself, but his integrity, his firm belief in the power of nonviolence, and his dedication to justice were unwavering. In the face of divisive issues and ideological differences, King never allowed his core values to be compromised. For any leader, maintaining personal and professional integrity, especially when faced with opposition, can be one of the most challenging yet rewarding strategies. When facing tough decisions or moments of doubt, it's essential to reflect on your guiding principles. Whether those principles come from your personal faith, your professional code, or your vision for the future, staying true to them will help you stay grounded and resilient in the face of adversity. In conclusion, Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership was a complex and multifaceted journey. His story demonstrates the importance of holding on to a clear vision, cultivating psychological resilience, managing internal dissent, and embracing personal sacrifice when necessary. While the road was not easy, King's ability to endure, despite profound personal and professional challenges, offers invaluable insights for modern leaders. Whether you're leading a movement, a team, or simply striving to make an impact in your community, King's example teaches us that transformative leadership is not just about external victories. It's also about the mental, emotional, and spiritual resilience required to navigate conflict and stay committed to a larger vision of justice and change. As we reflect on Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, it's important to address the nuances that make his leadership story both inspiring and profoundly human. While King's commitment to nonviolence and justice has rightfully earned him a place as a revered symbol of moral leadership, his journey was far more complicated than the conventional narrative of a singular heroic leader overcoming obstacles. The complexities of his life and leadership challenge us to think critically about what it means to lead in the face of not only external oppression, but internal divisions and contradictions. One of the most debated aspects of King's leadership is his relationship with the growing radical factions within the civil rights movement. While King's vision of nonviolence was powerful and revolutionary in its own right, it was not universally accepted. Some activists, particularly younger Black leaders, became increasingly frustrated with what they saw as King's pacifism in the face of a brutal and often violent society. Figures like Stokely Carmichael and organizations like the Black Panther Party called for a more assertive, self-defensive approach to the struggle for racial justice. To them, King's nonviolent resistance appeared to be insufficient for the scale of the oppression they faced. The rise of Black power and other radical ideologies created a significant ideological rift within the movement, one that left King in a challenging position, defending his philosophy while facing criticism from those who shared his goal of racial equality but rejected his methods. This divide reflects a larger question about the evolving nature of movements for change. King's commitment to nonviolence was not simply a strategic choice, but a deeply held belief in the power of love and reconciliation. He believed that lasting change could only come through moral and spiritual transformation. Yet, his ideological opponents within the movement were advocating for a more immediate, often confrontational approach. For King, the challenge was not just political, it was psychological. He had to maintain his moral clarity and leadership while navigating the shifting dynamics of a movement in flux. His ability to continue advocating for nonviolence, despite the growing calls for more radical action, speaks to the strength of his character, but also highlights the internal struggle he faced as his own movement began to fracture. This fragmentation within the movement was not solely the result of differing views on tactics. It was also driven by personal and ideological clashes among leaders, some of whom saw King's leadership as compromising or insufficient. This internal dissent created a climate where King had to contend with competing visions for the future of the civil rights movement. While King believed in bringing people together under a shared moral vision, others felt that the urgency of the situation demanded more immediate, forceful action. King's deep belief in nonviolence was his anchor, but it also became the source of psychological isolation, as the movement splintered and some began to question his approach. Additionally, King's growing focus on economic justice and his opposition to the Vietnam War further complicated his relationship with allies within the movement. Many leaders and activists believed that the movement's focus should remain squarely on issues of racial integration and justice, rather than broadening to include global concerns or addressing poverty across racial lines. This ideological expansion alienated some who believed that King was deviating from the primary goals of the movement. King's efforts to address economic inequality and his critique of American imperialism placed him in direct opposition to mainstream political leaders, but also to certain factions within the civil rights movement who were not ready to take on such expansive challenges. These complexities challenged the conventional image of King as the lone, unifying leader who effortlessly guided the civil rights movement. While King's public image was one of unity and moral clarity, his personal and psychological journey was marked by moments of self-doubt, isolation, and emotional exhaustion. The tension between the external pressures he faced and the internal conflicts within the movement led to a sense of loneliness and frustration for King. Despite his extraordinary leadership, he was often caught in a psychological bind, torn between his commitment to nonviolence and the realities of a movement that was growing increasingly fractured and impatient. King's story also raises questions about the broader implications of leadership in transformative movements. How do leaders maintain their vision and integrity when the very movement they have built begins to diverge from their original goals or methods? How do leaders stay true to their values when those values are constantly being challenged from within and from the outside? These are questions that every leader, whether in social movements, organizations, or businesses, must grapple with when facing opposition and division. King's journey offers profound lessons about the emotional resilience required to lead through turbulent times, especially when those leading the charge are not in complete agreement about how to achieve their common goals. Finally, King's isolation also points to a larger, more universal truth about the costs of leadership. The burden of leading a transformative cause is not just about the external enemies you face. It is also about the internal struggles that come with navigating complex human relationships and competing priorities. King's story reminds us that leadership is often about standing alone in the face of division, making tough decisions, and enduring emotional pain for the greater good. His psychological journey provides invaluable insight into the nature of leadership, illustrating that true leaders are often those who, despite the immense toll on their own well-being, remain steadfast in their pursuit of justice. In the end, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and leadership were defined not only by his successes, but also by the internal battles he fought in the process. His resilience, conviction, and commitment to his vision, despite the overwhelming psychological cost, show that true leadership is not just about being in the spotlight. It is about the emotional and psychological strength required to maintain a vision of hope, even when the world around you seems divided. King's legacy is a powerful reminder of the immense challenges faced by those who seek to change the world and the toll that leadership can take, even on the most visionary and resilient individuals. The life of Martin Luther King Jr. is often celebrated for his triumphs and monumental contributions to racial justice, but behind the public accolades and speeches lies a profound psychological journey that reveals the complexity of transformative leadership. King's leadership was not just about uniting a divided nation, it was about maintaining his moral clarity, vision, and conviction in the face of constant ideological opposition, internal dissent, and profound isolation. His resilience in the face of these pressures demonstrates the psychological fortitude required to lead in times of radical change. King's story teaches us that true leadership involves not only leading in the face of external adversity, but also navigating the complexities of internal dissent, competing ideologies, and personal sacrifice. His ability to remain steadfast in his vision of nonviolence, despite the growing fragmentation of the civil rights movement, speaks to his mental and emotional strength. King's story shows that leadership is not without personal cost. It requires an unwavering commitment to a cause, an ability to manage internal and external conflict, and the resilience to continue moving forward when the path is unclear and the support of allies wavers. King's journey is not only a historical lesson, but a universal one that speaks to the challenges of leadership, the power of resilience, and the enduring importance of staying true to one's values in the face of division. His life was a testament to the courage required to lead through uncertainty, and his story provides invaluable insights into the emotional and psychological demands of transformative leadership. Martin Luther King Jr.'s story challenges us to reflect on our own leadership journeys, especially when facing opposition, division, or self-doubt. What internal conflicts or external pressures are you navigating in your life or work? How can you apply King's lessons of resilience, conviction, and moral clarity to lead with integrity, even when faced with dissent? Share your thoughts in the comments below, like this video, and subscribe to Behind the Legend for more deep dives into the psychology of history's most influential leaders. Together, let's continue exploring the human side of leadership and transformation. Thank you for joining us today to explore the untold story of Martin Luther King Jr. and the psychological complexities of his leadership. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other episodes to learn more about the human struggles behind history's greatest movements and figures. Stay resilient and stay inspired.